What's good people, and welcome to the Silly, Nerdy, Sometimes Wordy podcast. And I'm your host, BK, and this is episode 18, Fantasy Football, Part 3. It's week 1. Let's set your lineups. And in this week's episode, we conclude our fantasy football series. Now that week 1 is around the corner, you've drafted, how to manage your team moving forward with trades, injuries, setting your lineups, the active and inactive list. So we're going to get into that and a little more. Let's go ahead and get into it because we are not going to have any nerdy notes this week. Okay. All right. Hope everybody is doing well out there. It's been a little bit since I've been on. I'm glad to be on, talking to you guys. Thanks for listening. Okay, so we've drafted our team or teams for those of us in multiple leagues. And now week 1 is approaching. Week 1 is here. So now what do you do? So now what happens is you get to set your lineups starting on Thursday night, as well as Sunday morning and Monday evening. So what happens is you need to set your lineups, which your lineups is already set, but you need to make sure that the people you have in it is who you want. Specifically, this focus on like the Thursday game. You may or may not have players on the Detroit Lions or the Kansas City Chiefs for the upcoming Thursday, September 7th, week 1 game between the Chiefs and the Lions. So let's say you do have players. You want to make sure that's the players you want to keep in your lineup. Let's say you have the quarterback of the Chiefs. You have Patrick Mahomes, and you have, let's say you got Luck, you got Travis Kelce. Or maybe you had Jamar Gibbs, the running back, the rookie running back. Maybe you have one of the defenses. So you want to make sure that those slots are set in your lineups. And also, prior to the game, there's a list that comes out. It's called the active and inactive list. And that comes out 90 minutes prior to kickoff for every game. 90 minutes prior to your Thursday night game, your Monday night game, Sunday night game, and of course the Sunday afternoon games and those Saturday afternoon games late in the season / Saturday night games. So when you see that list comes out. If there's a player that's possibly questionable, he may be ruled out. He may be injured. And so if you see that a player is injured on that list, then you will have to remove that player and put him on your bench and get another player in there. Also, another thing I've been saying through this whole 3 episodes is always check your league settings. Check your league settings. You want to make sure that you know what's going on. So you have the active and inactive list. Like I said, it comes out 90 minutes prior to kickoff. You want to make sure that you have the players that are injured, that are ruled out, inactive, get them out of your lineup, and get a player that is active in your lineup. Okay? And let's talk about another thing that happens during the season. Let's say you go through week 1, your players the games have been played. Now it's Tuesday. So there is this thing called the waiver wire. And the waiver wire is where you can pick up and drop players. So there's a pool of players that's always available. And so this is where you look at those players and you can see possible, once you're looking at games, you see, other players that possibly weren't, a lot of times were not drafted, that started to do well, and you need to pick up a player. So you'll have to drop a player to pick him up, or if you have an empty slot, possibly a roster spot available, you can just pick him up. Now, the waiver wire, it just depends on the settings of your leagues in terms of the order of who gets first priority, whether it's last place gets first priority or a mixture or randomized, as well as those leagues that are that have the budget and in terms of how much you can spend on the waiver wire. I'm not going to get into that. Like I said, I prefer not to do those type of salary leagues, but there are a lot of people out there that do. There's plenty of resources out there to listen and get information on that. But the waiver wire is someplace where you can pick up players, especially when it comes to injuries and, of course, the bye weeks. So when you have your bye week, and the bye week is, the teams that don't play a particular week, they get a week off. And so when that happens, your player that you have in an upcoming week, you have to put him on your bench and put in another player in that spot for that week. Whether you have someone that's on your bench that you can just kind of plug right in, then no problem. But if you don't have a player at that position, whatever position, whether it's tight end, special teams, running back, then you'll have to go to the waiver wire. And then you'll have to drop a player from that position, and then you'll be able to pick that player up to insert him into your lineup. So again, the waiver wire is a pool of players so you can go and pull from to pick up players. And sometimes there can be, like I said, surprise players that you don't even see, that nobody drafted him, but he performed really well this last couple of weeks. So everybody's going to want him. So you're going to go and pick him up on Tuesday. And normally they take about 24 hours or so to process. If you put your waiver in on Tuesday, you should be on your roster on Wednesday. But depending on the settings of your league, sometimes it may take a little longer. So that's why I always say check the settings of your league. So the waiver wire, you're going to spend a lot of time on the waiver wire picking up and dropping players, especially when it comes to the bye weeks, as well as when your players get injured as well, whether they get injured in practice before the game or injured during the game and they can't get into that, they won't be available to play in the following week's game. So that's something important. Another thing, let's talk about trades and the trade deadline. So like in the real NFL, you are able to trade players. And so this is your chance to be a GM, so to speak, to a much, much less level than an actual NFL GM. So you are able to make trades with other players that are in the league. And you're able to do that by just going on to other people's roster and seeing if there's a player that you like on their team, then you can offer up a deal to get that player. For instance, let's say you did really great on drafting running backs and quarterbacks, and your running backs and your quarterback. But, you're lacking a wide receiver. If you get a better wide receiver to your second wide receiver or third wide receiver, you could, boost your team. So what you would do is, like I said, this is your chance to play GM. So you could offer a wide receiver for a wide receiver straight up, 1-for-1. Or you can offer multiple players for one player. For instance, let's just say there is a player you're targeting. Let's say you don't have, great receivers. You have a great running back. You have extra great running backs. Let's say you wanted Justin Jefferson. He's one of the best wide receiver in the league. He's in that top 3 tier. But you need to offer something really good to get him, and that player has the owner has to want to be willing to give him up. Let's say you have one great or two running backs that you would offer him or her for Justin Jefferson. Let's say you offered, I don't know, Austin Eckler, running back for the Los Angeles Chargers, and you offered, let's say if you just really wanted it bad, you happen to have Jamar Gibbs or Aaron Jones. Let's say you offer Austin Eckler and Aaron Jones for Justin Jefferson. Now, some people may say that's a great deal. I would be willing to give up Justin Jefferson for those two backs, depending on their roster, if they need running backs. So you also have to keep that in mind. Like, what the team that you're trading with, do they need running backs? If they need running backs, then yes. If they don't, then it's very likely they're not going to take the deal. So let's say, for the purpose of this exercise, that this team that you're trading with, the owner that you're trading with, does need running back help. And so you offer this trade to him or her. And in this instance, they accept the trade. And then you have Justin Jefferson. They have the two running backs. Obviously, you're down those two running backs, but you're okay with that. Now, in a lot of instances, that deal I just proposed is probably not good enough to get Justin Jefferson. And then you just kind of counter offer. Maybe the person that you're trying to trade with will counter offer and say, instead of Jamar Gibbs, I want this other player on your team. And you can say yes or no. And so it's kind of give and take with that. So like I said, you can go one for one running back for another running back, or you offer multiple players for one player. Or let's say you offer 3 players in exchange for 2 players. In some instances in the leagues, depending on your settings, you can offer potential draft positioning for the following year as well. But you also want to keep in mind that, like the actual NFL has a trade deadline. Well, so does fantasy football. And the trade deadline in fantasy football normally, most likely, takes place around the same week, around that time as the actual NFL trade deadline. So there's a deadline. You have to check your league settings. As I say, there's a trade deadline, meaning there's a date that is set up in your league per the league settings that says after this date, you cannot make any more trades after that date. And that normally happens in October, around, let's say, week 8 or 9. Although they've extended the actual trade deadline over the course of the last couple years. But normally it would take place in October, maybe November. So after a particular date, per your league settings, check your settings, then you will not be able to make any more trades after that. So you want to make sure that you make all the trades you want to make prior to your trade deadline. Because after that, the only roster move that you'll be making is moves via the waiver wire. So that is very important. So some people like to trade a lot. Some people don't trade at all. So I do some trades, but I don't do a whole lot. I do it as needed. So trading can be fun. It keeps the league active, especially when things happen, injuries happen, or So it just keeps it fun. Trading, whether you're trading with people in the league, or you're playing with random strangers. So it's just another way to keep you're being active and fun. And also, per the league settings, I guess your league can have a vote in terms of vetoing trades, like if they agree with the trade or not agree with the trade. But so that is something that you'll be doing during this season. Another thing that's happening during this season is towards the end of the season is like the NFL has the playoffs at the end of the season. Well, Fantasy football has the fantasy playoffs. The difference is the fantasy playoffs take place during the end of the NFL season. Depending on the league settings, it could take the course of over 2 weeks, maybe more. So normally it takes place within the last 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, depending on how early you start your playoffs at the end of the season. And so the playoff teams, depending on your settings, I know I say that a lot, but it just depends on how many teams you have in the league. And then that number gets cut down into half or more. So you have to qualify to make the playoffs. And also, if you're really good enough, if your record is really good, you can get a bye and not have to play anyone in that first week of the playoffs and go to the second round. So let's say there's a custom league you're in. Let's say it's 8 teams. And out of that 8 teams, only 4 teams will make the playoffs, which means 4 teams will not. And let's say out of a 10-team league, only, let's say 8 or 6 make the playoffs. So it always has to be an even number of teams to make the fantasy playoffs. And of course, you go through the playoffs and you play each other. Sometimes you play each other for 2 weeks to total up your points. Or you kind of do a one and done, kind of like the NCAA tournament. And then you get to the fantasy Super Bowl, your final matchup, which is the 2 teams in the last championship game, which normally takes place in the last week of the regular season. And then you play that game, and then whoever has the most points obviously will win. And so, yeah, that is the fantasy playoffs. You also want to keep in mind, you pay attention to how the season is going. So at the end of the season, teams are kind of winding down. So there are a lot of instances where you have your team, and if the team has clinched playoff spots or the number 1 overall seed, of course, nowadays there is no bye week for the second best team. There's only 1 bye week in each conference, where back in the day it used to be 2 bye weeks. So let's say you have some Kansas City Chiefs players, and let's say Philadelphia Eagles. Let's say they get the number 1 seed again. So you have Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, AJ Brown, and the Chiefs and the Eagles have already clinched their number 1 overall seed. So in the final week of the season, Patrick Mahomes may not be starting in that game. Jalen Hurts may not be starting. Maybe he's banged up, most likely. It's a long season. So those players are not playing in that game. So what do you have to do? You have to make some plans to say, okay, I don't have my number 1 quarterback. You need to be working the waiver wire to see what quarterback you can pick up in that place. You could also say that you can kind of be working the waiver wire prior to that championship matchup to say, ooh, the Chiefs looks like they're going to clinch the number 1 seed. And if you pay attention to press conferences and using notes, that Andy Reid, the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, says, we're not going to start some of our starters, or he may not even say it, but you'd have to be prepared to see that active, inactive list. And so you could be out really bad if you don't have that. So that's just something to pay attention to. Or even if teams that don't clinch the number 1 overall seed, but they have clinched a playoff spot, they also may decide to not have their starters play the game, or they may play 1 quarter and then pull them out, or at least they get a lead, they'll pull them out. So you have to take that chance. Do you want to have a quarter worth of points, or however much they're going to be in there to be in there, and then he's out for the rest of the game? So you have to make that decision. So just keep that in mind. That's something towards the end of the season. Okay. I think I've covered everything in terms of how to do in terms of going about managing your team. Um, you also, like I said, want to make sure as you're setting your lineups, make sure you don't have any empty slots when the team locks. So when that 1 o'clock time comes on Sunday, you want to make sure that all your running back slots are full that have an active player. So sometimes you don't want to go and you see your team and then, you see that there's a blank spot, there's a blank field, and you don't have a running back in slot number 2. And so because of that, you won't get any points. Maybe sometimes if your team is really good, it won't matter. You still win. Or because of not having those points from that particular slot, you'll lose. So make sure you don't have an empty slot as you're setting your lineups, because when game time comes, when kickoff comes, the system locks your roster, so you won't be able to make any changes. Meaning, let's say Thursday night, September 7th comes, and it is 8:20, as I believe when kickoff. And so when that happens, your stuff locks, so you won't be able to make any changes to the players that are in those games, as well as when 1 p.m. Eastern time starts, you won't be able to make any changes to those players in the 1 o'clock game. Same thing with the 4 o'clock or 4:25 game, as well as Monday night game. So just keep in mind as you're going through that and, checking your rankings and who do you want to start or you want to bench. So keep that in mind as well. All right, so we talked about injuries. They do happen, obviously, over the course of games and practice. We talked about trading, league settings, empty slots. We talked about the waiver wire, dropping and adding players. That's something you'll be doing. So yeah, I think that's going to be all for today. So I have a couple leagues that I'm in this year. I have one more draft to go in a couple days. So I'll be doing that soon. And as we are coming to the end here, I'll just have my takeaway over the course of these 3 episodes. And the takeaway is that fantasy football is fun. It's another way to watch the sport, and something that now this person, he's a fantasy football analyst. He's been in the industry for a long time. And I'm talking about Matthew Berry, who currently works for NBC Sports for the last few years. He was with ESPN a long, long time. And on the fantasy football podcast he was on for many, many years, he would always say you should invite someone new to your league. So that would be my suggestion. Invite someone to a league, just somebody new, whether it's family, friends, coworker, associate. Invite someone to the league, and they may have fun. They may like it. If they don't, that's fine too. So I'm quoting, like I said, Matthew Berry of NBC Sports. Invite someone new to the league. You never know. Yeah, that's all I have for you today, this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please continue to give us a listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pandora, iHeartRadio. We're pretty much in all of those places and more. So please check us out. Leave us a review, rate us, comment. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we're coming to the end. So until next time, we will talk soon.